Meet the man and corporate governance New York attorney who hosted Warren Buffett at Cardozo Law School in 1996 for a symposium that became his best selling book, The Essays of Warren Buffett Lessons for Corporate America. This is episode 2 of a 2-part series with Larry Cunningham, special counsel at Mayer Brown. You are listening to episode 27 of the Future is Bright podcast, and I am your host, Chris Batts. Welcome back, Larry, to the Future is Bright podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Great to be here, Chris. Thank you.
So, Larry, for the second episode, let's jump straight into this fateful moment where you had a desire to bring Buffett to Cardozo, the Symposium, and tell us more about how this came to be, who was present, what was happening.
Well, sure. Thanks again, Chris. It was 1996, and I had just become the director of the corporate governance program at the school, and my job included mounting powerful intellectual events in corporate governance. And as I pondered what that might look like, Warren Buffett occurred to me because he is an expert in corporate governance. It's not the first thing people think of when they think of Warren. They think of him as an investor and a business icon. He's really interested in and good at corporate governance, and he's taught a lot about boards of directors and their role in interacting with management. And so I had become acquainted with Warren's letters thanks to my own corporate professor, Elliot Weiss, who worked with Warren on an SEC plain English project and introduced me to his letters. And I read through these letters and I thought, and they were just scattered at that time. It's 1996. There's no real internet yet. There's no ebooks. And his letters were simply issued year after year. They had a decent following, not as galactic as today, but he was known within finance governance circles. Not quite a household name yet, but the letters struck me as gold. I mean, just gems that deserved a wider audience. And I described to Elliot how I thought they could be presented, and we could do a symposium on them. And he thought it was a great idea. And then we tried to figure out, well, how do we pitch this to Warren? And our dean, Monroe Price, was best friends with Warren's chief outside counsel, Bob Denham, who's a partner at Munger, Tolles and Olson. So Elliot and I explained the proposal to Monroe, and Monroe said, okay, I'll call Bob and tell him. So he did. Bob called me and got some more detail on the specific topics that I wanted to cover and how I would publish them and who would attend the event. And he said, well, that sounds good to me. I'll pass it all on to Warren, which he did. But then 6 weeks passed by before I finally heard back. I was on the edge of my seat. Back then, 6 weeks was a lot different than it is now. In some ways, not so long. But we didn't have the emails or text messaging, or even cell phones hadn't proliferated yet. So I was a little patient, but still on the edge of my seat. I called another mutual friend, Sam Butler, who was the presiding partner at Cravath. I worked with Sam. We did a lot of work for Berkshire. And Sam said, oh, don't worry. He's in China. He's traveling in China with Bill Gates, so he's just really busy. And again, that's a time warp thing, because today you could call him in China. Back then it was. So finally, one day I got home from work. I was in Washington. I was at GW, and I got home from work, and I hit play on my answering machine. There's another time dimension for you. We didn't have messaging, phone messaging. So you had to wait and get home and hit play. And I was listening to my messages, and one of the messages said, oh, hey, Larry, this is Warren Buffett. I'm calling you. Bob Denham told me about the symposium you're suggesting, and I think it's a great idea. I'd love to talk to you about it. And at first, I thought it was a prank. I thought it was one of my funny friends knowing I was on pins and needles poking fun at me. But it was him. It was Buffett. And so I called him back, and he was very enthusiastic about the project. And so we took it from there.
Amazing. And take it from there. What did that begin to look like? I mean, he's like, sure, I'll come to New York City and spend 3 days with you.
It was pretty cool. I mean, we had to plan it out. So that might have been in September or October. I'll get the time frame not exactly right. And then I think we were planning the event for May. So I had a lot of work to do. I'd done a fair amount of work. I'd read through all the letters. Again, these are organized just chronologically. No one had touched the letters in any way. They weren't republished anywhere. And moreover, you didn't have the kind of Westlaw Lexis nimbleness that you certainly couldn't find these online. You had to dig into the archives a little bit. So I pulled them all out, read them all, classified them by topic, thought about how they connected together, what the major themes were, what kinds of what a symposium would look like, what the panels would be. Began to think about who should be on them, who should attend. So that whole programming, the whole laying out, I spent the next several months doing, along with some colleagues whose input I sought and got both at my school, including Elliot, and others who understood the distinctive perspective and value that Buffett was bringing. I mean, so one tool I used just to try to identify what scholars should I bring to this is I just did a Lexis search for people who've cited Buffett, and I read like who knows something about what his views are on dividends or on buybacks or on staggered boards or on tax policy. And so I assembled a pretty good group, and I iterated with Warren. Here's a point I'd like to make up front and throughout. He was exactly as you perceive him, his public persona, and exactly as he behaves in his businesses. To wit, totally hands off, delegated everything to me, didn't second guess anything that I proposed, whether it was who's on the panels or what events we're going to have, which letters I should put in what order. His management philosophy is to put decision-making power in the hands of the people closest to the issue. And he did that with me, has done it the whole 30 years. So that's how I organized the whole thing, checking in with him, but not, he was very, very cool about it. With all that logistics planning, we mounted and hosted the event in about May. I've got the date around here somewhere. I guess it was 97. It's a 2-day event in New York City at Cardozo Law School on 12th Street and 5th Avenue. It was in our moot courtroom, so we had 200 seats. I mean, you couldn't do a conference with Warren Buffett with 200 seats today. It was full. No. We had 200 people, but you try to do this today, you need 40,000. And it was mostly my students, about 150, 160 of my students, and then 40 or 50 people, my entourage and Warren's. Put it that way. I invited 20 or 25 scholars and friends, panelists to be on the program, and then other friends who would be interested. And he brought his friends. So Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger, Warren's wife Susan, his son Howard, Bob Denham, his attorney, Charlie Munger, his partner, Ajit Jain, his chief insurance officer. Just down the list. The head of Geico was there. George Gillespie, who was a mutual friend. He was a partner at Cravath, who was Warren's estate lawyer at the time. Carol Loomis, his tutor and famous writer at Fortune. Sandy Gottesman, also a mutual friend who Warren has known since the earliest days. He just passed away this year, but he was a big shareholder of Berkshire Hathaway, and he was a friend of my law school. He was the chairman of the board of our university. So just a wonderful group of people. And I also had the Haymans were there. I think Carl Icahn stopped by. Other Michael Milken, friends of our university. And so Lou Lowenstein, a mutual friend, he was a professor at Columbia. He was also a lawyer. He was a partner at maybe it's Kay Scholler, and had been an advisor to Warren in some capacity, but just wonderful. And so, but the neatest thing intellectually was we had panels, as I said, finance, governance, M&A, accounting, taxation, and capital markets, and 4 or 5 people on each panel, and we had traction. Sometimes you get these gatherings together and people just talk past each other, and they leave in the same position they came. Here we had real engagement, identification of overlaps, and reinterpretations of positions, and some just wonderful intellectual gains. And it was just one of the best. I mean, I'm biased. It was a thing I mounted early in my career, but I've been to 200 symposia since, and it's hard for me to point to many that were as productive for those attending. So we had a blast. I'll tell you one funny story. I think it's pretty funny. Charlie Munger was sitting there in the audience, and the second morning of the program, I received a phone call from the person who was going to chair the panel on corporate finance. And that was going to be Ralph Winter, who's a pretty famous judge on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, former professor at Yale Law School, very conservative philosopher of business and life. He was going to chair the panel on corporate finance, but a colleague of his on the Second Circuit passed away, and so he was called out to attend the wake. So I wondered who should we get to be the moderator of that panel, and I walked over to Warren. He was sitting right next to Charlie, and I looked them sort of together in the eyes. I said, I need a moderator for the corporate finance panel. You know, Charlie, would you be willing to do that? And Charlie kind of rolled his eyes, signaling no. But that entire entourage that I just described around him, Susie, Sheet, Carol, Warren, were like, yeah, he'll do it. So he did on a moment's notice. I mean, this was 10 minutes later. Without preparation, Charlie got up and he's chairing this panel. He's got 2 people on each side of him. And he looked into the audience and said, well, just on a moment's notice, the accidents of mortality have brought me as the moderator of this panel. And when Larry just asked me to do this, I remembered the story about the Baptist bumpkin who was suddenly asked to be put in charge of a convocation of Catholic bishops who were about to debate revisions of the Mass in Latin. And Charlie said, but I figure I can moderate such a panel, so here I am. And then the guy, so, I mean, for those out in the audience who know anything about Munger, I'm sure you're laughing your heads off. It's quintessential Charlie. It's erudite. It's a little oblique. It's like it came to him. He had 10 minutes. He had no time to prepare. And anybody who was attending, or you might even guess, the moderation was masterful. I mean, he had part of the intellectual sparks I was referring to, and part of that traction he produced because he insisted on people, defending their positions to the end. So it got the debate joined, and you couldn't escape it. You couldn't just say, no, well, I don't believe in that. You had to defend and engage. And so it was the second day, but it was the first panel that second day. So it really set the stage for the rest of the day. It's like, this is going to be high octane, intellectual fireworks.
Charlie is beyond memorable in his execution whenever he's given a mic in the center stage. I am not surprised, and I am rather jealous.
I was on that panel, by the way, and it was not painless. I mean, he was brutal.
I believe it. Yeah, he knows where to cut and how. So extraordinary, Larry. The opportunity to bring these minds together to create this moment, and it produced something. It sounds like you guys. I mean, this launched a book for you.
Yeah, the idea was to put a showcase on his writings, which, as I said, had been sort of scattered and isolated. And so I went through binders of his annual letters and selected topics of general interest. So I left some of the insurance details out, topics that were, I selected his best treatment of a given topic. He may have treated, say, dividends over many iterations. I chose the best ones, or stitched together what aggregated to a complete exposition, and then organized them thematically so that they build upon each other, so that the result is something you can read in order as an arc, as a full-fledged narrative, or go back and pick spots. So yes, you're right. So that was, I put that initial draft of the collection on the table at the symposium. That was the centerpiece. That's what we all debated. That was our text, our reference, and it was, that may have also contributed to the sparks, because it was clear the terrain we were debating, and so I turned around and published that as a book. And here's that original version. I helped the law review editors helped me to produce this. We produced the annotated transcript of the event in the law review, and then I separately published the compendium of letters with an introduction by me, and released it. And I sent it out to, I didn't know the effect it was going to have. I really conceived of it as for this symposium, and trying to expand the audience and get it out to a more general audience, but I didn't know that it was going to attract the attention that it did. So I published it, and again I ran it by Warren before publishing it. He I think he might have had one comment on I think I put the amount of an audit fee in there. He said I'd really rather not have that in. So he read it. That was on page 174. But so yeah, we released it, and lo and behold, a reporter from Cardozo's on 12th Street and Fifth Avenue, right across from where the Forbes building used to be, and a reporter from Forbes had come over and attended the conference, and I met with him, and Chakravarti was his name, and he said, when you publish this thing, I got to come over to your office and run a story on it. So he did. We were just about to release it, and Chakravarti brought a team over, and they did a big interview with me and a photograph, and put me in Forbes magazine. And again, back then it was all in print, so I still have it. But it was like, I'm 30 years old. This is blowing me away. And it's Forbes magazine, which is one of the most influential things. So all of a sudden, the book is selling like hotcakes, but it was I didn't have any distribution set up. I didn't know. So I got to print large numbers of copies of this from my law review printer in Nebraska, and then try to get them out. And so I was receiving orders by telephone, by fax, by postal mail. So I went into business, and now that was one big drop of big rock in a pond. But then that sort of disappears, but you realize a lot of people would like to know about this and read it. So I then, went into marketing it and letting everyone know through direct, again, this is pre-internet really, but through direct mailings. I created leaflets, and I rode my bicycle all over Manhattan, dropping them at all of the quality firms who would care about this, and word of mouth started to build. I did some print advertising, but word of mouth started to big, and it started to scale. I got local bookstores to sell it. Borders and Barnes & Noble came much later, but I got the Museum of American Finance to stock it in their store, which sold hundreds of copies that first year. The New York Times annual book exhibit was held in that year, and they invited me to come. Or I knew Floyd Norris, who was a columnist at the Times, and I sort of finagled my way into a booth there. It was at that booth that the buyer for Barnes & Noble came and was very intrigued, and Floyd told him, "You should stock this." So we got in there, and then it was right that Amazon had just been created, and so I put the book up there, and in the first year, it was the best-selling title in business. They sent me a little plaque. I can't imagine Amazon doing this today. It was a little company. They were just trying to start out, but So for the first 7 years of this book, I did all that work myself. I had it, ordered the printing. I did the revisions. I did the reprinting. I had the boxes. This is all pre-Kindle. I had the boxes delivered to my apartment in New York. I'd receive the orders all day long, come home at night, type them up, send out, just doing everything, and which was a lot of fun. And it was neat opportunities too, because I did meet a lot of people. People they were interested in the book, but they were interested in talking about it, and so I began to become acquainted with a lot of people in the Berkshire ecosystem. And Warren invited me the very first year, invited me out to the annual meeting along with my nephew Justin, who was also at the symposium. And so just many friendships blossomed as a result of that, both intellectually and socially and business wise.
Is extraordinary. I mean, just an opportunity. Would love for you to share, Larry, a little bit of the different titles that you have now. I mean, there's a number of them, and things have evolved. So I know you've got some books there.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. The Essays of Warren Buffett were one of the first books I did. I'd done some textbooks. I'd done an accounting for lawyers book, which is now in its 8th edition. It's actually the #1 selling accounting book in law schools. So I've written 20 books altogether. My wife just counted them up. The most recent one I actually wrote with Stephanie, my wife, and it's called Margin of Trust. Subtitle is the Berkshire Business Model. And this book came about. Oh, thank you, Chris. That's great. Yeah, this book came about. The genesis is interesting because over the 20 or 30 years that I've been involved with Berkshire, one of the top 3 questions has always been, "What's the secret sauce? What makes Warren and Berkshire so special?" And there are 10 answers to that, and different people emphasize different things: intellectual curiosity, analytical discipline. You could go on and on. Accidents of history, opportunities, relationships, and their temperament, the partnership that Warren has with Charlie. There are lots of factors that have contributed to the distinctive achievements. But when we kept pressing and pressing and pressing, what we determined was the unifying trait in all of those features and all of the relationships that Berkshire has with its managers, with the sellers of businesses, its employees, and its shareholders, and Warren's relationship with all those people and with me, which I saw firsthand, was trust. Trust. In all of those features, you see a desire and a will to trust. And so we decided, let's unfold this and explore it a little bit, see if it's true. And we decided it was. That the Berkshire business model, the essence of it, is trust. And that explains most of the success. And I'll just back up 1 second. Warren Buffett and his colleagues, people like Charlie Munger, are deeply skeptical of human nature. They recognize that people will very often put their own interests above the interests of others, including those that they are supposed to be looking out for. And so they avoid interacting with very large portions of the population, whether it's sellers of businesses or applicants for jobs or others, because they just doubt most people are trustworthy. They're just very skeptical about that. And on the other hand, they are convinced that there is a small number of people who are eminently trustworthy. And their business model, and this explains, I think, so much, is to select trustworthy people and then go into business with them and give them unbridled autonomy. So all of the managers that they've employed to run their operating businesses as well as their investment portfolios are in that small cohort of people who are infinitely trustworthy. And so they screen out to get those people and then give them a green light. They look for shareholders who will trust them to do the right thing with their capital over long periods of time. And they'd rather not have shareholders who don't have that trust. They don't want impatient traders who move around a lot. They don't particularly like to have lots of indexers who don't really care about Berkshire. And there's no sense of trust in that relationship. And you could go down the sort of the nexus of contracts in a corporation with lenders, suppliers, brokers, agents, and see that Berkshire's directors, Berkshire's the most distinctive feature of all those relationships with Berkshire is trust. And so that's all in contrast to the standard model of business organization in the United States, which is one of commands and controls and compliance policies and procedures where there is endless second guessing, oversight, review, judgment, bureaucracy is what Warren calls it. And so those are the sort of the two models at the extremes: the trust-based business model of Berkshire and the command and control model that tends to dominate in corporate America. And obviously, companies can be somewhere along that trajectory, that length. Berkshire's clearly at one end. You can pick your favorite red tape company at the other. And so our book is about these special, distinctive roles that trust plays in all of these relationships. And then we identify a number of other companies who tend to be on that side of the continuum as well.
I know that was one of your last books that you've written. Are you going to still write, Larry? Do you still have more books out there?
Yeah, probably will. Stephanie counted up 20, and so when I pivoted from a year or two ago, I pivoted away from university life to a law practice, and so my time budget, and I'm on more boards than I used to be, so my time budget's a little bit different. I don't have as many minutes in a week to devote to book writing. I do write a lot of columns and articles and essays, so I'm still very enamored of the written word and productive and so on. But it takes an additional bit of mental space, time, energy, and attention to craft a book. So I'm not currently engaged in any project, but it's always there in the back of my mind. So. Not the next couple of years, but probably eventually.
Probably eventually. Would you gather that you would probably get stories and ideas from all your board work and your time at Mayer Brown?
Yeah, it's actually true. I mean, one of the that's one of the ways a book builds is through episodes and instances and examples, and I am capturing some of them in the articles and essays that I'm writing. I mean, I just counted them the other day. I've written 20 published essays this year in various outlets: Bloomberg Law, Law 360, Pensions and Investments, the Harvard Corporate Governance blog, and I see themes emerging from there, sort of a contemporary view of the landscape of corporate governance, or dynamics in shareholder management relations. So you're absolutely right. There's a budding garden, but I don't know exactly what it's going to look like yet, or when and how I would act.
I understand. Larry, are there any kind of key things for my listeners to keep an eye out for that you're noticing within corporate governance that could be issues down the line, things we should be mindful of?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest dynamic afoot is the movement and counter movement around the notion of ESG, which stands for environmental and social and governance values, that has become initiated by the United Nations 20 years ago and has become extremely topical in the past 5 years, in which advocates and special interests of various kinds, some institutional investors, seek to have corporations prioritize ecological protection or human capital management and administrative arrangements to prioritize those goals. And much of it has been very productive and positive and almost old wine in new bottles. But some has perhaps been a little more aggressive and over the mark or over the top. There's some critics that think that the movement, productive as it was hijacked more recently by more zealous advocates who even go so far as to deny shareholder interests. And so you've seen a backlash, is the nickname the media has given it. It's in any event a critique and a stalling out of that movement. And so we're at a it's not exactly a standstill, because the ESG movement is still very powerful, and its skeptics or opponents are very actively digging in. So, but it's certainly a crossroads or an inflection point, and I think that's the thing I'm paying most attention to, and most of my clients, both sort of the boards of directors of the world, managers, and shareholders are all monitoring this. Some are participating in it. And my own sense of it, if that's what you're interested in, Chris, is that I take a historical view of this, and even partly a lens through Berkshire and through Warren Buffett's philosophy. But we've had debates over corporate purpose for a century, and periodically a momentum gets behind some reform ideas, some ways to make corporations more accountable to more constituents or more socially conscious. And then it's the pattern tends to be an exuberance that sets in that gets excessive. And that provokes first skepticism, then resistance, and then backlash, and an equilibrium ensues. So it's a very sort of Hegelian, thesis, antithesis, new equilibrium. And so just to run through 4 or 5 episodes, in the 1930s and 40s, Burley and Dodd debated the purpose of the corporation. Is it primarily to make money for shareholders, or primarily to promote the interests of employees, customers, and others? And that was a very interesting debate, and mostly settled out after some achievements, let's say, from those who the multi-constituent model, mostly settled out to be tending to be a shareholder-driven model, but attending to the interests of protecting employees, catering to customers. And we saw again in the 60s and 70s a debate that was epitomized by Milton Friedman on the right, pure shareholder focus, and Ralph Nader on the left, a much more thoroughgoing egalitarian conception. And again, with lots of people in the middle. And in the debate, the Naderites made a lot of ground. The EPA was created, the consumer protection movement crystallized, and it sort of refocused that it's not just making as much money as you can for shareholders, but you got to protect the environment. You got to protect your customers. And so, but that settled down to an equilibrium that it wasn't that you're dismissing shareholder interests, but you're accommodating contending interests. And then in the 90s, we had the corporate social responsibility movement that, again, reinforced advocacy on behalf of employees, customers, and others. And again, I think quite sensibly making some good contributions, including around the shareholder rights movement, where it was actually like, we cannot, nor can we have a system in which management entrenchment is the order of the day. So it, again, achieved some results, but when that was pushed too far and shareholder interests were going to be marginalized again, a backlash set in, an equilibrium followed. And I think we're in the middle of the same pattern where ESG was very attractive because, after all, it's hard. I don't know of any line of literature that doubts the importance of protecting environmental resources, air, water, and so on. Nor is there any rational business model that denigrates the importance of human capital and broader community concerns. So it was, it was not surprising that such energy got behind the movement. But nor is it surprising that some opportunistic participants pushed some aspects a little too far and a little too hard. And I think when you get to a point of saying, well, shareholder interests don't count, it's not going to work, because you need to pay a return to those people too. And so that equilibrium is, I think, coming. Exactly what it will, where the balance out will come. But that's kind of where I'm seeing a lot of people spending a lot of their time, energy, and attention.
It definitely is front and center. And what you just described, Larry, sounds like a great book thesis. So that might be a great one to consider next. Such an honor and a pleasure to have you, Larry. Honestly, I think we could do a couple more hours of this. There's just such great content here, and the richness of the history that you've done in your career and documenting gentlemen like Warren Buffett and others, where you've isolated just incredible amounts of wisdom that, frankly, hardly any corporations are using these days, but still has this renowned history of outrageous returns for companies who think long term and who have investors and management and shareholders. Quick question: how can people find you, contact you? What's the best way?
I'd say LinkedIn is the best way.
Okay.
I'm a presence there. Keep the bio more or less up to date, and so welcome the connections there.
Very good. Well, again, Larry, it's been an honor, a pleasure. I appreciate your time today.
Likewise, Chris. Thank you very much.